The land looked lifeless. Miles and miles of cracked earth stretched endlessly under a burning sky. No rivers cutting through the terrain, no forests, no shade, just heat, dust, and silence. The kind of place most people would glance at once and immediately assume nothing could ever grow there. But that assumption didn't stop the people who lived on that land. For generations, native farming communities stayed rooted in these harsh deserts, long before modern machines and global supply chains existed. While outsiders saw emptiness, these farmers saw something else entirely. Beneath the surface, hidden from plain sight, there was potential. Not obvious, not easy to access, but very real. And slowly, over time, they began to unlock it. It started with a simple realization. Water didn't always have to be visible to exist. Even in places where no rivers flowed and rain barely fell, something was hiding deep underground. Vast reserves of ancient water, trapped beneath layers of rock and sand for thousands of years. These underground reservoirs, known as aquifers, became the foundation of everything that followed. At first, accessing this water wasn't easy. Early methods were slow and labor-intensive. But native farmers adapted. They learned how to draw water from deep below the surface and bring it upward, turning something invisible into something usable. What seemed like a barren desert began to reveal its first signs of life. Small patches of green appeared, then larger ones, and eventually, entire fields began to take shape where nothing had existed before. But pulling water from underground came with a problem. It wasn't endless. The more water that was used, the faster those hidden reserves began to shrink. And if used carelessly, they could disappear completely. That's where innovation stepped in. Instead of flooding fields the traditional way, farmers began adopting a smarter approach. Water had to be used carefully, precisely, almost surgically. Every drop mattered. This shift gave rise to one of the most recognizable farming patterns ever seen from above. Perfect green circles in the middle of endless desert. At first glance, they look almost unnatural, like something drawn onto the earth rather than grown from it. But there's a reason behind that shape. It comes from a system designed to maximize efficiency while minimizing waste. Imagine a long metal arm slowly rotating around a central point, spraying water evenly across a field as it moves. That's the idea behind center pivot irrigation. Instead of watering randomly or unevenly, this system ensures that every part of the field gets exactly what it needs. Nothing more, nothing less. From the ground, it looks like a machine doing its job. But from the sky, it transforms the landscape into a pattern of green circles scattered across a sea of sand. And those circles changed everything. Crops that once seemed impossible to grow in desert conditions began to thrive. Fields started producing food at a scale no one expected from such a harsh environment. What used to be imported from distant regions could now be grown locally. But even that wasn't enough, because early attempts at large-scale farming came with serious consequences. Back in earlier decades, aggressive expansion pushed the land too far. Water was used faster than it could be sustained. Inefficient systems drained valuable resources. And eventually, it became clear that simply growing more wasn't the solution. Something had to change. So the strategy evolved. Instead of trying to force the desert to behave like fertile farmland, native farmers began working with the environment rather than against it. They started focusing on crops that could naturally adapt to dry conditions. Plants that didn't demand excessive water. Crops that could survive and even thrive under intense heat. One of the most important among them was the date palm. These trees weren't just another crop. They were perfectly suited to the desert. Deep roots allowed them to access water buried far below the surface. Their structure provided natural shade, protecting smaller plants growing beneath them. And their fruit became both a staple food and a valuable export. Over time, millions of these trees spread across the landscape. Entire regions became known for their dense clusters of palms, transforming dry terrain into productive agricultural zones. Harvest seasons brought in massive quantities of dates, feeding local populations and reaching markets far beyond the desert. But dates weren't the only success story. In certain elevated regions where temperatures dropped slightly and humidity increased, another crop began to take hold: coffee. Unlike the flat desert plains, these highland areas offer just enough variation in climate to support coffee cultivation. Native farmers adapted their techniques again. Instead of relying entirely on irrigation, they took advantage of seasonal rainfall and natural soil fertility. Terraced farms appeared along hillsides. Crops were carefully managed to match the rhythm of the environment rather than forcing constant output. And the result? A unique variety of coffee that became deeply tied to local culture. It wasn't just about agriculture anymore. It became part of identity, tradition, and daily life. Further transformation came from another direction. Regions with access to better soil and underground water started experimenting with fruit cultivation. Mango trees began to spread across these areas, producing fruit that thrived under the right balance of heat and water availability. These weren't random successes. Every step was calculated. Every decision was shaped by trial, error, and adaptation. Native farmers weren't just growing crops. They were engineering an entirely new relationship with the land. And then came one of the most significant upgrades of all: technology. Not in the sense of replacing farmers, but in empowering them. Satellites began playing a role in agriculture. From high above the earth, images could capture patterns invisible from the ground. Heat signatures revealed how much water crops were actually using. Subtle changes in color showed which areas were healthy and which were struggling. This information changed how decisions were made. Instead of guessing how much water a field needed, farmers could now measure it. Instead of planting blindly, they could choose crops based on precise environmental data. It turned farming from a reactive process into a predictive one. And in a place where resources were limited, that shift made all the difference. Water usage became more controlled. Crop selection became more strategic, and waste was reduced significantly. At the same time, irrigation methods continued to evolve. Drip irrigation systems started gaining attention. Instead of spraying water over large areas, these systems delivered small amounts of water directly to the roots of plants. No evaporation, no unnecessary runoff, just targeted hydration exactly where it was needed. Greenhouses also entered the picture, allowing farmers to create controlled environments within the desert itself. Temperature, humidity, and water levels could all be adjusted to support crops that otherwise wouldn't survive outside. Piece by piece, the desert was being redefined, not through brute force, but through precision and understanding. But perhaps the most impressive part of this transformation wasn't just the technology or the scale. It was the mindset behind it. Because none of this happened overnight. It was built over decades of learning, adapting, failing, and trying again. Early mistakes forced better strategies. Limited resources pushed innovation, and the harshness of the environment demanded efficiency at every step. What started as survival slowly turned into mastery, and the results became impossible to ignore. Fields producing fruits, vegetables, and grains, farms supporting livestock, local production replacing imports, and entire communities benefiting from a system that once seemed impossible. But the story doesn't stop there, because turning desert into farmland is only part of the challenge. Keeping it sustainable is where things get even more complex. Water reserves still need protection. Climate conditions continue to shift, and the balance between growth and conservation becomes more critical than ever. So the next phase of this transformation isn't just about expanding farmland. It's about protecting it. Because building green fields in the desert is impressive. But keeping them alive for generations? That's the real test. Keeping farmland alive in a desert isn't just about growing crops. It's about understanding limits. Because every green field comes with a hidden cost. Water is still being pulled from underground. And unlike rain-fed regions, these reserves don't quickly refill. Once they're gone, they're gone. That reality forced native farmers and planners to rethink everything again. Instead of expanding endlessly, the focus began shifting toward sustainability. The goal wasn't just to grow more food, but to grow it smarter, using fewer resources while maintaining output. One of the biggest changes came from moving away from water-heavy crops. Earlier efforts had tried to grow everything locally, even crops that demanded massive amounts of water. That approach didn't last. It drained resources too quickly and proved unsustainable. So the strategy evolved into something more balanced. Crops were selected based on efficiency. If a plant required too much water compared to its yield, it was gradually phased out. In its place came crops that could deliver more with less. This shift wasn't just practical, it was necessary for long-term survival. At the same time, livestock farming adapted as well. Instead of relying heavily on traditional feed that required large agricultural areas and water consumption, alternative feeding systems were introduced. Synthetic and imported feed helped reduce pressure on local farmland. This allowed resources to be redirected toward crops that made better use of the environment. Greenhouses became more advanced. Inside these controlled spaces, farmers could grow vegetables with far less water than traditional open-field farming. Conditions were optimized to reduce evaporation, protect plants from extreme heat, and increase productivity per square foot. And the results were noticeable. Fresh produce that once had to be imported could now be grown locally in a controlled and efficient way. But farming wasn't the only sector evolving. Water itself became a resource that needed active management, not just extraction. Monitoring systems improved. Data became central to decision-making. Every field, every crop, every irrigation cycle started being tracked and optimized. Even the timing of watering changed. Instead of watering during the hottest parts of the day, systems adjusted to operate during cooler hours. This reduced evaporation and ensured that more water actually reached plant roots instead of disappearing into the air. And then there was the role of large-scale planning. Efforts began to restore degraded land rather than constantly expanding into new areas. Regions that had been overused or damaged were given attention. Soil quality was improved. Vegetation was reintroduced. The idea was to repair what had already been used, not just move on to untouched land. Tree planting became a major part of this effort, not just for agriculture, but for the environment as a whole. Trees help stabilize soil, reduce erosion, and create microclimates that support other forms of life. Over time, planting initiatives aimed to bring millions of new trees into the landscape. And that created a ripple effect. More trees meant better soil retention. Better soil meant healthier crops. Healthier crops meant more stable food production. It all connected. It's the understanding of the land, passed down through generations, combined with modern tools, that makes the difference. Knowing when to plant, what to plant, and how to respond to subtle environmental changes. Those are skills that no machine can fully replace. That blend of tradition and innovation is what turned the impossible into reality. What once looked like endless sand is now dotted with signs of life. Fields producing food, trees standing where there was once nothing, water being used carefully, not wasted, and a system that continues to evolve. Because the real achievement isn't just turning desert into farmland. It's proving that even the harshest environments can support life when approached with the right mindset. Not through force, not through shortcuts, but through patience, adaptation, and a deep understanding of how nature works. And that lesson goes far beyond desserts. Because in a world facing growing environmental challenges, the ability to do more with less isn't just impressive, it's essential. If this kind of transformation can happen in one of the harshest landscapes on Earth, it raises a bigger question about what's possible elsewhere. Not every place has the same conditions. Not every region has underground water reserves. But the principles remain the same. Use resources wisely, adapt to the environment, and build systems that can last. That's how barren land becomes productive. And that's how it stays that way. What once seemed like a limitation can become an advantage when understood deeply. Harsh climates can teach efficiency better than abundance ever could. Scarcity forces smarter decisions and sharper thinking. Every drop of water begins to carry real value. Every harvest becomes a result of careful planning, not luck. Communities grow stronger when survival depends on cooperation. Knowledge passed through generations becomes just as important as modern tools. The land starts to feel less like an obstacle and more like a partner. Small improvements begin to compound into massive change over time. Even fragile ecosystems can recover when given the right conditions. Balance becomes more important than speed. Long-term thinking replaces short-term gains. Innovation becomes a necessity rather than a choice. The environment shapes the strategy, not the other way around. And slowly, what once felt impossible starts to feel repeatable. The desert no longer represents emptiness, but opportunity. A reminder that resilience can reshape even the most unforgiving landscapes. And that with the right approach, growth can happen where it was least expected. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more stories that uncover how innovation and resilience are reshaping the world.